Melting, A Duke's Winter Heart. Written by Abby Ayles and published by Starfall Publications. Save more with our offers and bundles on our website, starfallpublicationsbooks.com. Subscribe for more audiobooks. Enjoy. Chapter 1. Sarah Lockridge pulled herself upright in the carriage, stretching her short legs forward across the seat and casting a playful grin in her friend's direction. Long trips like these always leave me aching to run about or splash in some cool water. I am not sure I will be able to abide this carriage one more moment. You speak as though you had a choice, Margaret Hayward said with a playful note of her own. She was the opposite of Sarah in every way, tall, dark-haired, and dark-eyed. She had been of marriageable age for a few years, just like Sarah, but unlike her hot-headed friend, Margaret had multiple suitors lined up for her hand and the opportunities therein. Sarah leaned out of the carriage and let the warm summer wind lift her hair up in the breeze and carry it gently aloft. Her hair was so blonde it was almost white, a feature that only seemed starker when matched with her brilliant green eyes. Her father, who rarely seemed to notice her existence, had once acknowledged that she looked like an old Irish selkie, the mystical seal folk who could shed their skin and, in some cases, enchant poor fishermen to their doom. "I'm not ready to be home," Sarah said softly, leaning her cheek against the window sash. "Perhaps at Fuller Mill we might take a break?" "It's a short walk from the mill to your parents'," Margaret said. "Someone might see us dabbling in the creek." "Perhaps the coachman will let us out early." Sarah brightened and straightened, knocking against the wall of the carriage until the driver opened a small door for communication. "Could you drop us at Fuller Mill, Hopkins? We wish to stretch our legs. You can carry our belongings on to Talon Hall." "What about Miss Hayward?" "Her parents are sending a coach to take her on from Talon Hall. I'm sure they won't mind if she's a few minutes late." The coachman paused for a moment, clearly facing a familiar dilemma, whether to give in to his mistress's commandment and risk her father's disapproval, or to hope for the best. In the end, Sarah saw the carriage slowing near the peaceful mill, and she and Margaret were allowed to clamber out of the carriage with only their bonnets to carry home across the fields. "Give my best to my parents," Sarah said with a blithe smile, "and tell Lucille I'll be home directly." "You could have brought Lucille, you know," Margaret said as the two girls picked up their skirts and waded through the tall prairie grass towards the silent mill. "You are two peas in a pod, and I'd have enjoyed her companionship along with yours." Sarah smiled to herself. When most people used the phrase, "two peas in a pod," they meant it figuratively, but in her and her sister's case, there was never a more literal interpretation. Born identical twins, Sarah and Lucille Lockridge were indistinguishable to most people. They were the same height, had the same waist-length white blonde hair, and had similar mannerisms and tones. They could only be told apart by their clothing choices and their personalities. While Sarah Lockridge wore daring colours and brilliant hues, Lucille wore pastels in the simplest styles. While Lucille was content to quietly collect fans and gloves and shut herself away indoors, Sarah had a hungry mind and longed for adventure. Many people didn't even know that Lord Edgar Lockridge, the Earl of Huxley, had twin daughters. Because Sarah so often went out in society alone, they just assumed she was his only daughter, and when Lucille ventured out, they were often mistaken for one another. "Lucille has been quiet as of late," she mused, as the two girls drew near the shallow stream beneath the turning mill wheel. "I've enjoyed our time together, but I worry about her. Lucille has always been quiet. It's just her way." Margaret looked over at her friend with alarm. "What are you doing?" Sarah had already stripped off her stockings and slippers and was hiking her bright blue skirts up to wade into the stream. My feet are aching, she said with a joyous laugh. Would you leave them to languish in slippers after a day of travel? But what if someone were to see? Margaret gasped, putting one foot behind the other as though to ward off Sarah's unseemly ways. It would be scandalous. Sarah, I can see your knee. No one is passing this way, dear. Sarah closed her eyes and felt the subtle current tug at her ankles like a needy child. The water is so cold. You should try it. Who knows what is in that water? Can't you wait until we are home and can draw a proper bath? Margaret, Sarah scolded, levelling a laughing gaze on her friend. You speak grandly of how brave you are and how many adventures you wish to go on, but when it comes to a simple matter of standing in a clear stream, you balk at the drama of it all. Margaret looked from side to side with a nervous giggle. All right then, she sniffed daintily. I will touch it with my hand. She knelt down and sank her pale wrist into the water until it covered halfway up her forearm, and then withdrew her arm just as quickly. With bravery like that we will conquer the world, Sarah said dryly. She waded a bit farther into the stream, letting the water lick at her knees. I want to do things, Margaret. Not silly little things like this, but the sort of things I read about in my books. Men get to travel all over the world on boats and have all sorts of adventures. They come back telling their tales, and we women are meant to swoon over them without hungering for adventure ourselves. It isn't fair. You always were obsessed with books. Didn't your father used to warn against it? You really haven't spent much time at Talon Hall in recent years, Sarah said, half teasing and half sad. Margaret's mother wasn't a fan of the Lockridge family, and Margaret had spent more and more time travelling with her family and locked in music studies as the years went by. Nothing's changed with my father, she went on. He would still prefer I kill the adventurer in me before it causes him embarrassment in the House of Lords. What does the House of Lords care about a young girl? You know what father always says, Sarah said quietly. If I bring shame on the family name, then there's no coming back from it for him. I would ruin him, and that would ruin the plans he has for the government. Then stop fussing about it, Margaret said sensibly, drying off her arm with the edge of her shawl. Stop reading books and longing for things you can't have. There's no reason to indulge in such a way, especially when you know you'll end up married just like the rest of us, sewing and caring for children and attending grand parties. The best you can hope for is a kind and interesting man who will leave you alone most of your life. It sounded horrible to Sarah, but Margaret spoke of it all as though it was the ultimate dream, as though nothing else in the world could be as perfect as settling for a man who was boring enough to leave you alone for the rest of your life. Sarah had known Margaret since they were young girls. In fact, they'd met at their first coming-out season when they were 16 years old. Lucille had been there too, but she'd spent the whole of her time in the upstairs of the mansion, examining the paintings in the art hall. Bored, Sarah had wound her way about the ballroom, avoiding the offers to dance and pretending vague interest in the goings-on therein. She'd sighted Margaret Hayward leaning against a banister, with a wan little look of nerves on her face, and she'd walked up to her. I know it seems like a bore, she had said, but if you stick with me, we shall bring some magic to the evening after all. They had been fast friends ever since, even if that friendship had looked more like occasional letters and rare social gatherings as of late. It didn't matter so much for Margaret, who seemed to have a bevy of female friends at her beck and call, but for Sarah, there was no one else except Lucille. And in some ways, she and Lucille were so similar that it was more like being friends with oneself, one's quiet, distant self. She climbed out of the creek and wiggled her toes in the sunshine. "I don't want to climb back into my shoes," she said softly. In truth, she didn't want to climb back into her life. A week at the seaside with Margaret was like fresh air, and she knew the stale coffin to which she would be returning. When her stockings were on and her slippers laced up again, the girls began walking across the open fields towards Talon Hall. "Margaret," Sarah said after taking a deep breath, "I so rarely get to travel to your house, and you so rarely travel to mine. Do you think we live similar lives?" "It's hard to know," Margaret said, snapping a head of wheat off a nearby grass and rolling it in her slender fingers. "After all, you rarely talk about your family." She shrugged. "I suppose most families are the same, though. Sometimes they're annoying and drag at your nerves, but more often than not, everything is very quiet and peaceful. It's easy enough living with your own family. You know everyone's rhythms and desires. You know that no matter what happens, they'll be there for you, even if they scold you first." Sarah kept her head turned so that Margaret couldn't see the tears in her eyes. That's what she'd always wondered, if her family situation was the same as other people's, and she'd had something of an answer just now. It wasn't annoyance, or dragging at nerves, or scolding that plagued her family. It was a silence that was unexplained, a complete absence of camaraderie or shared trials, the thought that anyone would care enough to scold in the first place. Lucille was too quiet to be of assistance, too willing to fold under her father's iron will. Edgar Lockridge was a pale weasel of a man who looked unassuming at first glance, but was, in fact, as strong physically as he was politically. He had a tight fist on all his business holdings, whether domestic or abroad, and that fist didn't loosen when it came to Talon Hall. Sarah still remembered the first time he'd caught her reading a book on the anatomy of insects. Lucille had been in the room, doing her embroidery by the fireplace, as was her wont, and Sarah hadn't even noticed her father's presence until Lucille let out a little startled cry. Edgar Lockridge had snatched the book from Sarah's hands and perused it in silence for a few moments before sending it skittering across a nearby tabletop. "There's no use for a girl to read such things," he'd snapped. "But Papa," she'd cried, too young and naive to know how idiotic it was to disobey him. "I want to learn. Don't you want a child that you can be proud of, who might be able to help run Talon Hall when you are gone?" "The only way you could have been a child I was proud of is if you'd been born a boy," he'd hissed, slicing at her heart with every word. "I asked God for a boy, and he gives me 2 girls. What kind of joke is that?" Eventually, the Earl had gotten his heir, a youngest son named Edmund, but Edgar Lockridge was never satisfied. He had political ambitions that needed to be acted out in the now, not in the vague future, and Sarah could feel his frustration whenever she was in the room. If he had been given sons instead of daughters, he often told her he would already be at the top of the social sphere. As might be expected, this cold reception taught Lucille and Sarah to stay far away from their father. Their younger brother, Edmund, was at first a joyous addition to the family, but as he grew older, he spent more and more time with his father and grew jaded and shallow. All this might have been softened by the presence of a tender mother, but though Sarah had only good things to say about her mother, Marianne, she rarely saw her. Marianne and Edgar spoke to each other only when necessary, and Marianne spent most of her days locked away in a darkened room, complaining of a headache or some other such malady. She turned to Margaret as Talon Hall came into view beyond the last hill. "Thank you for walking with me, friend, and for the welcome distraction this week." "My pleasure," Margaret answered with an empty smile. Sarah wondered what she was thinking and thought she could guess. "It's unlikely I'll see you again for some time," She bit back her disappointment, and the remainder of the walk continued in silence. The Hayward carriage was already drawn up outside the impressive Talon Hall structure, and when Sarah had seen Margaret safely inside, it took off down the sedate drive lined with birch trees. Sarah watched until her friend's ride was out of sight, and then walked quietly up the marble steps and through the front door. Inside, the family's long-time butler, Ayles, greeted her with proper formality and, relieving her of her bonnet and gloves, held out his hand towards the dining room. "Your family is waiting for you in the dining room, Miss Lockridge." Sarah blinked. Her family never ate together, except when hosting guests, and even then, it was shocking to have them all present. "Do you mean my father, Ayles?" "All, my lady." "My mother?" "Yes, my lady." "Sarah." It was Lucille with Edmund close behind. Edmund's face was drawn and grim, and for the first time, Sarah thought she could see something of a man in his dark eyes. Lucille, in contrast, looked beside herself. "I'm so glad you're back. Sarah, something dreadful has happened." "Lucille!" Edmund interrupted with a frown. "Papa said not to say a word until dinner." Edmund turned to Sarah in a tone that bordered on imperious. "He asks you to change and come down to dinner at once." Sarah looked past Edmund. "Do you want to accompany me upstairs?" she asked softly. "Lucille will stay with me," Edmund said, laying a hand on his older sister's arm. He was looking more and more like his father every day. Sarah cleared her throat. "I'm not sure what's going on, but I'll change at once and come down. Tell father I'll only be a few more moments." "I'll send a maid up," Lucille said softly. She seemed different, broken. Sarah's heart went out to her, but she didn't want to make matters worse by interfering before she knew the facts. She bowed quickly to her brother and sister and made her way upstairs, her heart in her throat and her mind spinning with new worries. Chapter 2. "We'll call this session to a close," the Lord Speaker announced in the same droning monotone he'd been employing all day. In response, the gathered gentlemen in the gold-hung House of Lords stood in a cacophony of screeching shoes and tapping canes, to stream out of the meeting room like children from a schoolhouse. It had been a particularly long day. Augustus Sutton, Duke of Whitehall, sat in his seat as the other lords left, wiping a hand across the beads of sweat on his brow and wishing, more than usually, that he had rescinded his right to his father's seat and escaped all the nonsense of political intrigue. Today's drama had centred around the Earl of Huxley's new bill, a chance to gouge more money out of the poorer class by raising the candle tax yet again. The Earl, Edgar Lockridge, had a long history in the House of Lords that was less than reputable, and every step of Augustus's since he'd come of age to participate in the political goings-on had been impeded by the Earl's conniving ways. "A rough showing today," one of the other lords said as Augustus stood to depart. It was Lord Martin, a middle-aged man who rode both sides of most issues, choosing peace over principle. "Do you care if I'm frank with you, Lord Whitehall?" Augustus tried to contain his temper. 35 years old, and he still felt like he was battling the angry response of a hot-headed youth in moments like these. "I don't see that I will be able to stop you." "Is that any way to talk to a friend and ally?" "If you were either of those things, you would have stood up for me when I fought against Lord Huxley's bill today. You know that it is wrong in so many ways, and yet you are willing to stand by and allow that miscreant to perform highway robbery on the poor people of England." He clenched the back of the seat in front of him, trying to pour his anger into the chair rather than the man in front of him. Diplomacy was a skill he'd never mastered. He tried to put a softer edge into his voice. "You have a good heart, Lord Martin. You should put it to good use." Lord Martin shifted nervously to his other leg and affected an imperious tone. "You say I have a good heart, and I warn you that you have a bleeding one. It will get you in trouble, standing up for the rats in the sewers." "If I don't stand up for them, who will?" Lord Martin changed tacks, his voice softening. "You don't really think the tax will hurt them, do you? They're already paying a candle tax, and it's only a small change." "It's a significant change, with an open-ended clause that could allow further gouging," Augustus said, watching the last of the lords clear the room. His voice echoed in the emptiness. "And what bothers me above all is that such a change is entirely unnecessary. Huxley is only forcing the issue because he bought stock in a whaling company and thinks the sperm whale oil candles will profit if people don't want to pay extra for beeswax." "Look, old boy," Lord Martin said, laying a hand on Augustus's shoulder. "You're known for fighting the lesser man's battles, but this is David against Goliath, and as pious as you are, I'm not sure you have God on your side." "I think it's more likely he's on mine than on Lord Huxley's," Augustus muttered under his breath. "Lord Martin, if you took a strong stand on this, it would make you sympathetic to the common people. You would get good press over it." "This isn't the House of Commons," Lord Martin said with a laugh. "If I needed to look sympathetic to the common people, I certainly wouldn't fight this losing battle. Tying my name to yours is a recipe for disaster. You spoke up for women's rights last year, and before that, you made a name for yourself as a philanthropist with your sewer bill. And that's a bad thing." Augustus fought the urge to rub his temples in frustration. "It makes you look weak," Lord Martin said, his voice sobering. "And weak is a bad thing in the House of Lords. Maybe if you'd picked your battles a bit earlier in the game, you would have had more supporters now." "I have some supporters, perhaps enough to stop the bill," Augustus ventured. "Some men stand by their principles." Lord Martin yawned and took his gilded cane in hand. "Some do. And I will, if you can find a way to make your principles profitable." He strode out of the hall without a backward glance. Augustus put on his top hat and followed suit, walking down the stairs outside to his waiting gelding and mounting with his thoughts still tethered to the day's work. He went back over the arguments he'd posed, the witnesses he'd brought forth, and the information he'd dug up. At each turn, Edgar Lockridge was staring him down with superior wealth and political ambition. He wasn't sure what else to do. As he neared his manor, she came back into his head, as she did on occasion, pale and wan like the ghost that she was. "You've got to keep trying," she whispered. Letty. The one soft part of his life, back when he thought that love was achievable and happiness was a reasonable goal, the thing that had driven him toward philanthropy in the first place. He wished sometimes that she would leave him be. She was gone, anyway, beyond his reach. Why must she keep rising in his mind to torture him? But then, when her memory seemed to fade, he always grew frantic with fear that he would forget her soft skin, the way she laughed, or the graceful twist of her neck when she looked over her shoulder at him. Then he would conjure up all the most beautiful and painful memories and cradle them in his mind's eye until she came back to softly torment him in moments like these. "You have to keep trying." It was an unnecessary command because Augustus had no intention of stopping the fight. He was a stubborn man above all else, and he would be stripped of all his title and honour before he gave up on the floor of the House of Lords. Letty wouldn't have stood for Lord Huxley's selfish laws. She would have pestered Augustus until he laughed with frustration and turned the heat of his passion against the rich man's deception. People used to say that Augustus and Letty were cut from the same cloth. They even looked similar back then, both tall with light brown hair and dark eyes. But in the years since Letty was lost, Augustus had changed. Even he could see it in the reflection that stared back at him in the mirror. He was broad-shouldered, strong as an ox, and well-muscled from extensive time outdoors. He had buried himself in activities when he lost Letty, and he had the hunting scars on his chest and the casual athleticism to show for it. But his eyes, there was the greatest difference. They were so dark they almost looked black, and there was an empty fury in them that he could see when he caught sight of himself in a glass. She'd put the fury there, just as she'd put the melancholy. When he neared his home, Augustus began to feel the tension of the day drain from his body. In its place was a weariness he could barely fight. He had planned to go out that evening to parade around some fine living room and listen to amateurs sing at a dinner party, but he couldn't bring himself to play the politician tonight. All he wanted was a pipe, a stout drink, and an early turn in to bed. He handed his horse off to the livery boy and climbed the marble steps to his door 2 at a time. Robbins opened the door before he knocked and ushered him inside with usual poise. "Your Grace, a good day in town." It was a day. Augustus was fond of Robbins, but he'd never really grown into the casual friendship that some of the upper class entertained with their servants. He'd been raised on decorum as a boy, and he held to those same principles as the heir to Whitehall. "I'll have no dinner tonight, just a drink in the study and bed. Will you alert the footman?" "I will, Your Grace." Robbins nodded, taking his hat and gloves and handing them smoothly off to a nearby maid. "But, Your Grace, you received a letter just a few moments before you arrived. A message from the House of Lords." "Infernal place," Augustus complained under his breath. "Will they not take their pound of flesh and leave me be?" Robbins cleared his throat, as he always did when he wasn't certain how to respond. He reached into his pocket and took out the letter. It was written on an elegant paper and sealed with a crest Augustus knew only too well. He took it, opening it as he walked into the nearby parlour. Robbins followed close behind. The seal was telling. It had the eagle with talons extended that could only mean one thing: Edgar Lockridge of Talon Hall. It wasn't enough that the man had avoided the House of Lords that day and chosen instead to send a proxy to argue his despicable bill into law, but now the gentleman in question was taunting him, sending him letters as though the two were friends rather than mortal enemies. Augustus tried, as a rule, to reserve judgment, but he found Lord Huxley to be the greediest of men, someone who was never satisfied with his position or his wealth, and always sought to line his pockets at the expense of those who could not defend themselves. Lord Huxley was not above bribery, and on more than one occasion Augustus had learned that his plans had been thwarted because Huxley had managed to manipulate one of the lords into taking his side. The letter was simple, written in Lord Huxley's familiar neat hand, and as Augustus read, his brow blackened in anger. He had been prepared for a bribery attempt, for an undercutting of the moral integrity of the institution. In such a cut and dried situation, he would have thrown the letter into the fire and thought no more of it. After all, it was not the first time this lord had made threats to keep him from following through on his political gains. But as his eyes tore through the letter, he realised it was far worse than bribery. "What is it, Your Grace?" Robbins asked nervously. Augustus turned to him with a retort on his lips. He thought about telling the older man it was none of his business, or scolding the servant for overstepping his bounds, but in the end he realised he wanted someone to hear the truth. "It's blackmail," he said stiffly, plain and simple. "Blackmail, Your Grace?" Robbins asked with a nervous tick in his eye. "We should alert the constables immediately. We shan't stand for such behaviour." Augustus scanned the letter again, his stomach sinking with every word. It was not the sort of business he could tell a constable about, and he knew it. "No, No authorities, he said, trying frantically to think of a way out. But every avenue that he landed upon was met by yet another blockade. He had thought himself impervious to such things, but he realised with each glance at the letter that Edgar Lockridge had found his weakness. Letty rose in his mind, laying a cool hand on his shoulder, but the sight of her stung even more against the contents of the letter. The impudence of what Lockridge had written was the worst of it. What right had any man to demand of Augustus what this man demanded, and all for a better political position? It was infuriating, and more than that, it was ridiculous. It was an insult to Augustus, to Letty, to all the people who were clawing their way out of the gutter even now. In a blind fury, Augustus reached for the nearest object, a vase, and hurled it across the room in anger. Even as it left his fingers, he knew it was an unwise thing to show his emotions so frankly. But a long-buried childish desire to hurt something like he'd been hurt rose up in him. The vase hit the opposite wall between two wall hangings and shattered into innumerable pieces. The noise cracked throughout the house, and Augustus heard Robin's gasp behind him. "Your Grace! What's wrong?" Augustus lowered his head, his anger as shattered as the vase at his feet. "I'm sorry about that, Robbins. I'll tend to it myself in a bit." "No need, Your Grace," the older man said, already bustling over to sweep up the pieces. "But I wish you'd tell me what bothered you so. Is there anything I can do to help?" "Change is coming, Robbins." There was Letty, pulling away from view. Augustus wanted to reach out and grab her, but she had no place in this nonsense. Her memory was a beautiful and fragile thing that contrasted awfully against the black command of the letter. "What changes, Your Grace?" Robbins asked. Augustus raised his head and looked at the old man, speaking as though from a very great distance. "I'm getting married, Robbins. Chapter 3. Dinner was a grand affair. Too grand, Sarah thought nervously. Her father sat enthroned at the far end of the table, with Edmund smugly on his right, Marianne across from him, and the twins shoulder to shoulder on his left. The footmen worked silently to lay the food out, 3 courses of grandeur with unusual attention given to the decoration and presentation. It felt like the holidays Sarah remembered as a child, when the food was extravagant, but the conversation was thin. Nobody made any effort to explain Lucille's pale face or the whole spectacle of the evening. The soup course passed in silence, as did the main course and the salad. Sarah looked down the table at her mother and felt a stab of pity. Marianne looked pale and dark in her heavy silks, and there were rings around her pretty eyes. She rarely joined them for dinner, not after the miscarriages that followed Edmund's birth. There had never been another child, although more than once there was hope of one. Sometimes, if she looked very closely, Sarah felt like she could see the lost children sitting with her mother. Marianne brought them with her everywhere she went, lost in the mist of her empty eyes. "Would you like to hear about my journey?" she asked suddenly, giving in, as she always did, to her responsibility to break the silence. "Seeing as I've only just returned." "As you wish to tell us, I cannot imagine that we have much choice but to listen," Edmund said dryly. "That's ridiculous," Edgar said to his son. "There is always a choice about listening when women are talking." Sarah pursed her lips and looked at her plate, her appetite fleeing along with her desire to speak. It was always this way, her father shutting down the conversation before it had a chance to even begin. "But go on," he said suddenly, surprising her. "Explain to me how your visit with Miss Hayward was a magnificent success." She could hear the sarcasm in his voice, but when she glanced at Lucille's pained face, she knew she would do anything to take the pressure off her sister. She forced a smile, It was a good trip. The seaside is beautiful this time of year, and Miss Hayward is an engaging companion. That's hard for me to imagine, considering her father is the greatest bore ever to walk the face of the earth, Edgar said with a sneer. Do you know that the Reverend Hayward was offered a full inheritance by his father, but he chose instead to pursue a career in the church? I think that very honourable, father, Sarah said quietly. Yes, I'm sure you do. You are always drawn to the foolish things of this world. Sarah took a sip of sherry to cover her nerves. It is not foolish just because it is different from your view. After all, would you have all the world be lords and ladies? Who would run our church services or tend to our doctoring? I think it worthy of Mr. Hayward to put his own betterment to the side in pursuit of ministry. I think it foolish, and I stand by that, Edgar snapped. You have too many thoughts in that head of yours, my daughter. If you don't tend to that failing, soon you will find yourself a spinster. I hardly think my thoughts are the only thing keeping me from marriage, father, Sarah said dryly, conscious that the entirety of the table was watching their sparring match with bated breath. No, Edgar snapped. Also, your wayward nature and your stubborn refusal to show even a breath of femininity. In Edgar Lockridge's mind, femininity was the sort of shrinking, simpering fragility that always needed a fan against the heat and a cloak against the slightest draught. He went on, casting a sly glance in Lucille's direction. Actually, daughter, you bring me to the point of this evening. Lucille has something to tell you all. Lucille? Sarah turned to her sister, and her heart sank. The girl had always been frailer than Sarah, and she looked now as though she was being led to the stake. Her lip trembled, and she reached a shaking hand to wipe her mouth. Go on, Edgar barked. Lucille swallowed hard and spoke, her voice soft and clear in the dark room. I am to be married, she said softly, to the Duke of Whitehall. Sarah blinked. She heard her mother's fork clatter to her plate and saw Edmund's youthful smile curve upwards. He looked as satisfied as her father, although she didn't know why. Pardon me, Sarah ventured. Why in the world are you to marry Lord Whitehall? Have you even met the man? I only know him by name, and I cannot think of a single association in which we traded words. You can hardly have met him. Do not think that Lucille's tendency to stay indoors has kept her entirely out of the limelight, Edgar said with a self-satisfied smile. In fact, she did have the chance to meet the Duke just last week at a dance. You were gone, of course, and so you can't be expected to know everything about your sister. Is this true? Sarah asked. Lucille nodded dumbly. Of course it is true. Her father went on with an expansive wave of his hand. I have secured a reasonable match for your sister, and she is very lucky in the choice I made for her. The Duke is not only titled, but he is wealthy as well. I serve alongside him in the House of Lords. Yes, father, Sarah said slowly. That is the only context in which I have ever heard his name spoken, and you have never done so with anything but disdain. What has convinced you to give your daughter to such a man in marriage? You detest the man. I have my reasons, and Lucille can hardly complain. Edgar hardened his jaw. I dislike your impertinence, Sarah, and you should know it is just that sort of headstrong behaviour that makes you an unfit candidate for such social and political alliances. You speak of it as if it were business rather than a matter of the heart. It is business! Edgar hurled his napkin to the table and stood suddenly, rattling the glasses. I will have no more lip from you, lass. The marriage will happen, and sooner rather than later. He strode from the room in long, lanky strides, and, in his absence, the table was momentarily silent. Then Edmund rose too, hurling his own napkin down. "You ought to listen to father," he said, with his nose tilted to the sky. "Women ought to know better than to question their elders." When he had gone, Sarah turned to her mother. "Mama, you cannot think this is a good idea, a sudden arranged marriage to a man father despises. It cannot be right." Marianne raised her eyes slowly from her plate and looked at her headstrong daughter with an uncertain air. "I hate when he talks like that," she said at last. "Like what?" Sarah asked. "Like his father." She stood to leave as well. "Edmund could be so much, but he mimics Edgar in the most awful manner." "What of Lucille, Mamma? What of her future?" Sarah asked, feeling frantic. Marianne left with a sad smile, evidently unwilling to raise her hand against the will of her husband. Sarah watched her go, and then turned to her sister with earnest eyes. "Lucille, you must tell me everything." The girl looked up at Sarah with tears in her green eyes. "I thought it would be some time before I married, Sarah. Father says I have the disposition for it, but I don't think he's right. I get so nervous, as you know, and I hate to travel. I want to be brave like you, but I'm so afraid." Sarah looked at her with pity in her eyes. Lucille had never been made of the stern, rebellious stuff that kept Sarah's spirits high, and she had always been a little weaker, suffering from bouts of ill health even as a child. Sarah could see the brave little set of her chin, and the way she tried to be strong even while her hands were shaking, and it tore at her heart. "Tell me what happened, Lucille. Why the Duke? When did you learn of all this?" "I don't know why the Duke. Have you met him, Sarah? He's a fierce man with dark eyes and a frightening disposition. I met him at the dance, just as father said. But we hardly talked. I knew enough of father's dislike for him, and so I kept my distance. The few words we exchanged were curt and cold. His eyes are so dark, Sarah." Sarah had not met the man herself, but the idea of him looming over her sister brought a spurt of defensiveness into her heart. "He shouldn't have frightened you like that," she said. "He didn't mean to, I'm sure." Lucille swallowed hard and cast a worried glance at the door. "And he's not the reason this betrothal is a problem, Sarah. I have other reasons." "Tell me." "You must promise not to share." Sarah tilted her head as though to say, "Have I ever betrayed your trust?" And Lucille rushed forward as though she feared to lose her nerve otherwise. "I love another." Sarah felt a chill of nerves, and she too looked to the doors to make certain of their privacy. "What? For how long?" "For how long?" Lucille asked with a sad little laugh. "What an odd opening question. Shouldn't you be wondering who this gentleman is?" "Well," Sarah said sensibly, "I can assume from the cast of your face that the gentleman you love is not the Duke, and therefore other questions rise to the surface. I cannot tell you who it is at the moment, but I've fancied this man for some time." "I will not ask you to tell," Sarah said slowly. "I know this is selfish," Lucille said softly, "but in my heart, I wish it was you that our father had chosen to marry Lord Whitehall. You are beautiful and talented and brave. You have no other that you love. You are free." Sarah felt a catch in her heart, and she stared at her sister. "As for the beauty," she said gently, "we share that qualification to perfection, I'm afraid. And you are braver than you think, Lucille." Something was blossoming in her mind, an idea that she wanted desperately to push away, but nonetheless indulged. "Maybe there is a way out of this for you." "How?" Lucille burst into tears at last, the wetness sliding down her cheeks and dripping onto the lace of her gown. "I've thought of it all week while you were gone, Sarah. If our father wants me to marry this man, you know I haven't the courage to stand up to him." Sarah wanted to protest. to assure Lucille that she could stand up to Edgar Lockridge, but in her heart she knew that her sister was not ready. Any show of resistance would be met with a force too mighty for poor Lucille, and Sarah knew her sister would end up as vacant and tired as Marianne had become over the years. The subtle thought was growing in her head, and impulsively she put out her hand and grasped her sister's arm. "What about me, Lucille?" "What about you?" she asked. "I could do it," Sarah said, hating the words but feeling in her gut that it was right all the same. "We look identical. No one would ever be able to tell us apart, and Father never pays us any mind anyway. He wouldn't realise that a switch had been made until it was too late." "Sarah, I wasn't serious when I said I wished you would take my place. I mean, I think you'd be better suited to the madness to be sure, but I wouldn't wish such an arranged mess on you for anything. You are a wild and free spirit, and you shouldn't commit yourself to a marriage so early in your life." "I've always wanted an adventure," Sarah said softly, trying to look braver than she felt. "And what greater adventure than to save your sister's true love? I have no one I care for, as you pointed out, and no prospects. I can pretend to be mild-mannered and sweet until the Duke has been convinced, and then you are safe to pursue your own heart." "This is preposterous," Lucille protested, twisting her hands nervously in her lap. "I can't ask you to do this." "You aren't asking, I'm offering. Lucille, you deserve more than to be a pawn in our father's game. Everyone does. This way, I get to show him what I'm worth for once, even if he's too blind to know the difference until it's too late." "What if the Duke is a brute?" Lucille asked. Sarah thought about that. In truth, she wondered if someone her father despised so much might, in fact, be an honourable man, but that was all beside the point. Even if the Duke was a brute, Sarah was better suited to take his abuse than Lucille would ever be. Lucille was soft and delicate, and needed tender care. Sarah forced a smile. "He's not a brute, I'm sure. That kind of thing only happens in dramatic stories." Both girls fell silent, because both girls knew it wasn't true. Brutes weren't only in stories. Their own father was proof enough against that theory. At last, Lucille looked up with tears brimming in her eyes anew. "Are you sure, Sarah?" It was an acceptance, and despite her fear, Sarah felt relieved that Lucille would be out of danger. Putting on her bravest smile, she said, "I've never been surer of anything in my life." Chapter 4. "Will you be having the lady in the parlour for tea?" Robbins asked, bending at the waist and keeping his eyes distant from Augustus. He had been calm after the broken vase, but Augustus could see that the butler was still wary of everything surrounding Lucille Lockridge's visit that day. "I will," Augustus said as kindly as he could manage, wishing to allay the older man's fears. "We may take a tour of the house and grounds afterwards. Doubtless, her father will want to know the fullness of my estate." The last comment came out dry and sarcastic, and he saw Robbins's face whiten a bit. "Your Grace, if you don't desire the marriage, then what reason have you to go through with it?" Augustus sighed, his heart heavy. "Robbins, your service has been invaluable over the years, and you have earned your place as a trustworthy butler. But you will understand that the circumstances surrounding this union are private." "Of course, Your Grace." "She will be coming with a chaperone," Augustus went on. "Her brother, Edmund." He'd been glad to hear that, as glad as one could be under the circumstances. The idea of enduring Edgar Lockridge's presence, as well as his blackmail, was unimaginable. He would barely be able to remain civil as it was. "I will serve tea shortly after they arrive, Your Grace." "Thank you, Robbins." The butler left, and Augustus sat in a chair to wait for his guests. He had met Lucille Lockridge once before, and then only for a few minutes. He hadn't known then what her father had been planning, and so he hadn't committed her image to serious memory. Now he tried to recall her face. She had been pretty, he thought, though a bit pale and frail. She'd spoken hardly at all, and if he remembered correctly, he'd wanted the conversation to end as quickly as possible to be rid of her fearful trembling. He had a pit of dread in his stomach at the thought of their impending meeting, and an added guilt. It was as though he could feel Letty over his shoulder, her memory betrayed and worn through by his decision to give in to Lord Huxley's demands. Robbins reappeared, bowing formally and showing the two guests into the room. "Miss Lucille Lockridge and Mr. Edmund Lockridge," he said stiffly. She was not just pretty, after all. She was beautiful. Augustus remembered Lucille having a sort of fragile beauty, but there was something wild in her eyes that he hadn't noticed before, like the sea. She stood by her brother with her head down, only raising her eyes after going through the dutiful curtsy, arrayed in a pale pink gown that set off the almost white hue of her feathery hair. She had lace everywhere, and a ribbon braided into her hair. "Lord Whitehall," she murmured. "Miss Lockridge, a pleasure to see you again." He could hear the lie in his voice. He sounded anything but pleased by their meeting, and he was doing nothing to hide it. He turned stiffly to Edmund. "And I don't believe we've had a chance to meet." Edmund was a tall young man, but he still had the frail, slender form of a boy. He smiled politely at the introduction, but his eyes were too much like his father's. "Lord Huxley sends his greetings," he said, eyeing Augustus as though he had been commissioned to bring back a minute report on the Duke's every action. "I'm sure he does." Robbins returned with 2 maids and a footman in tow. "Tea?" "Yes. Lay it over there before the fireplace, and we shall partake of it at once," he said, thankful for the mundane distraction. They walked together to the hearth and sat around a low table as the maids apportioned cake and tea to each in their turn. Augustus took the opportunity to scrutinise his guests, primarily his future wife. Her movements were graceful and refined, but there was something in Lucille that he had missed at their first meeting, a sharp intelligence in her eyes, as though she was waiting for something to happen. "I'm glad you could come today," he said awkwardly. "Are you?" She returned innocently, meeting his eyes for the first time since her arrival. Her eyes were 2 pools of emerald. He thought of Letty and felt suddenly guilty. Instead of answering her question, he turned to Edmund. "Have you been out riding much this season?" he inquired. Edmund raised his eyebrows. "I've no interest in roaming about outside like a peasant," he said serenely. "There is too much to attend to indoors." "You're a young man," Augustus pressed. "This is the time in your life when you can afford to explore a bit. Get outside, see the fresh air." "I have different interests." "Do expound." "I wish to grow up like my father, with his political prowess and aspirations. Such intellect must be built in books and a study of social occasions, not out in a field under the open sky." "When you say a study of social occasions, do you mean balls and needless parties?" Augustus asked wryly, already disliking the boy for his attempt at imitating Edgar. "If you will take such an uncharitable view of the situation, then yes." Augustus took a sip of tea to cover his disgust, and then turned the conversation to Lucille's direction. "And what do you think?" he asked. "Do you think your brother could benefit from some time in the sun, or are you of the opinion that his education up until now has been sufficient?" Something in Lucille's face shifted as though her thoughts ran much deeper than the surface, but in the end she simply lowered her eyes and said meekly, "I wouldn't question my father's judgment in this matter." Something about the way she said it confirmed a fear Augustus had had since he first received Edgar's threatening letter. This arranged marriage wasn't just about the Earl's daughter ending up with a duke. It was a dangerous political move to silence one of Lockridge's most vocal opponents. Augustus couldn't be certain of Lord Huxley's motives, but looking at the quiet girl sitting across from him, he began to suspect that the Earl wanted to use this girl to leverage Augustus's vote in the House of Lords. The marriage wasn't just a chance to demean his opponent, it was a chance to further Lord Huxley's control. The man's gall infuriated him, and he couldn't separate Lucille from her father. He stood abruptly and walked a few steps towards the window. "Tell me about yourself," he said harshly. "Excuse me?" Lucille ventured after a moment's pause. "Were you addressing me?" "Yes." He turned on her with a hard stare. "Tell me about yourself." She looked back at him with a steady gaze, and for a moment he thought he saw the wild look in her eyes again, but then she blinked, and all seemed meek and empty-headed again. "Well, you know my name is Lucille." "What are your interests?" "Everything that ought to interest a young lady," she said softly, twisting her hands in her lap. "I sing and play the pianoforte. I embroider." Augustus wanted desperately to roll his eyes, to make her feel her ignorance, but something in her small face halted him. He took a deep breath. "You embroider?" "Yes, quite well." "Perhaps you would play something for us on the pianoforte," he said, motioning towards the instrument in the corner. She followed his gaze with a nervous glance of her own, forcing a smile. "Not now. I'm far too shy." "You'd rather talk?" Augustus asked with his own feigned innocence. "I only inquire because I wish you to feel most at ease, and conversation doesn't seem to be high on your list of priorities." She stared back at him, her face pale, and he realised with a start that he'd misjudged her. She wasn't ignorant at all, and she knew exactly how much he meant to wound her. "I do not wish to play," she said slowly, purposefully. Edmund looked at his sister with a strange expression on his face. "You seem quiet today, Lucille," he said with a question in his voice. "Are you all right?" "I'm always quiet," she mumbled in reply, picking up her teacup and taking a quick sip to mask her discomfort. Augustus had a strange feeling that he was talking with them about something he didn't fully understand. On top of Edgar's blackmail and deception, he was ill at ease with the thought. She looked up from her folded hands, and her eyes fell on a vase of dried flowers sitting above the mantel. "Those are lovely roses," she said softly. "Or I suppose they were, once." Augustus closed his eyes briefly. She could have no idea how large her misstep had been, but he still blamed her unconsciously. This little sprite, this wild-eyed girl trapped in a docile body, had no right to speak about anything that reminded him of Letty and those flowers, stiff and dulled on stalks of dried grass, were one of the few memories in the home that still reminded him of his lost love. They were in a blue and white vase, dark with age. He could still remember the way she'd looked when he'd handed them to her all those years ago, fresh and soft, like the sunset that bloomed gold and red behind her. She had taken them from him before answering the question he'd come to ask. When she'd agreed to marry him, the flowers had fallen to the wayside, and she hadn't bent again to retrieve them. Augustus himself had picked them up when Letty had gone home for the evening. He'd put them carelessly in a vase and forgotten them, as all bachelors do. If the marriage had gone through, Letty would doubtlessly have discovered the dried flowers and tossed them out for fresh blooms. But instead, they had stayed in a corner of his room until he found them long after everything was lost. Then the dried stems had become a memento mori that he could not part with. Not for anything. He followed Lucille's gaze there, and something in him rose up, violent and surly. "They are lovely still," he snapped, "to me." She looked at him with her head cocked to one side and her eyes wide and innocent. "Are they from your garden?" He didn't want this, any of this. He didn't want this little waif with her wide eyes and her father's wishes. After Letty, he had determined to live out his days in solitude. One of his distant relatives would inherit his title when he died, and the estate would be preserved. The idea of any other woman walking these halls where he had so wanted his beloved to walk, any other woman sitting across from him at the table or hosting parties, it was garish. "Perhaps you would like to see the garden," he said coldly, walking too quickly across the room. "Perhaps you would like to inspect the house in detail, if we are to have an agreement, an arrangement, as your father so eloquently put it in his communication, then surely you deserve to ascertain the extent of my wealth." "That's not what I meant." She stood, her hands limp by her sides. Edmund stayed sitting, clearly bored. "I was not presuming to know what you meant, my lady," he said, almost able to taste his guilt and fury. "I was only offering what I know you wish to see, so that we are not standing on pretence." "Lord, man, should we leave you alone?" Edmund asked with a weak little laugh. "We can come another day." Augustus was tempted to agree, but before he could open his mouth, Lucille took a step forward with a hard little edge in her voice. "Actually, I would like to see the house." She stared at him, her eyes level with his, and that deep part of her dangerously close to the surface. "And the gardens! Everything, actually. I would like to take stock of your estate, even if my brother does not wish to." "Of course I'll come," Edmund said, rising to his feet. "You need a chaperone." Lucille's eyes never left Augustus's. Right, if we didn't have a chaperone, this entire affair would be ridiculous. As Augustus stared into her impossibly green eyes, the fire he saw in them and the blatant defiance in her words sparked something in his chest. Something he hadn't felt in a long time. A grim premonition told him that, somehow, Lord Huxley had set before him a trap he couldn't avoid. Alas, he wasn't so sure he actually wanted to. Chapter 5. Sarah had not known what to expect during her first meeting with the Duke. Having never seen him before, she had expected to feel some boredom, some disdain, perhaps even some secret amusement. Instead, she felt a wave of simmering, white-hot anger. She had a part to play, bowing her head and imitating the reasonable and kind attitude of Lucille, but every nerve in her body felt poised to spring back in response to Lord Whitehall's boorish behaviour. He was being intentionally cruel. Though his words deflected off Sarah's apathy like blunted arrows, she couldn't help imagining how they would have sliced Lucille to the bone. She was a sensitive girl. If Sarah hadn't had the good fortune of stepping in her place, Lucille would have been crushed by Lord Whitehall's intimidating height and glowering eyes. She followed him now into the hall outside with Edmund just behind. The Duke's back was tight, straining the seams on his already oversized coat. He was less frightening from the back, almost like a wounded bear, the way he loped down the hallway with his shoulders slightly hunched. She took the few moments of silence to look around her. It was an impressive estate from the outside, all marble and carved columns, but the inside had an almost feminine touch that took the elegance to another level. There were hand-picked works of art, from modern and ancient artists alike, carefully polished floors, and delicate moulding. Looking around, Sarah could feel a woman somewhere in the woodwork. She wondered who it was and where she was now. "Up ahead, we have the library," Lord Whitehall said in a dull voice, as though he really was giving a museum tour. For obvious reasons, we won't stop there today. We will continue on to the second solar, and I will show you the view of the gardens." "Why aren't we stopping at the library?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice meek. "Pardon me, but I don't understand your obvious reasons." "It's like any library. There are books and a fireplace, and nothing else of interest." "That is plenty of interest for me," Sarah said, stopping in front of the library and refusing to budge. She didn't want to give away her true nature, but she also was losing patience with his constant intimidation and assumptions. "And when you say it is like any library, you confuse me. No two libraries are the same, for every book has its own story." She looked up and met his dark eyes, realizing with a start that she had almost given herself away. He was looking at her with a strange expression, as though he could see directly through her to the heart of the matter. He opened his mouth, shut it again awkwardly, and then shrugged. "Let us see it, then." They walked inside. It was smaller than Sarah's father's library, but more accessible. The book spines were all different and well loved. She had been sneaking into her father's study to steal books since she was a little girl, but there she always had to dance around the attractive books bought for show in search of the real gems. Here, she got the feeling she was looking at a carefully curated selection, that any book she chose would have some worth. Sarah walked along the first row of shelves, running her fingers along the spines and feeling the undulating surface like a great stabilizer. She took a deep breath and chose one at random. "Revelations of Divine Love," she said, reading the title to herself. She looked up at her brother, Julian of Norwich. Edmund shrugged with disinterest. A book on romance? His lip curled with a knowing beyond his years. How appropriate. Sarah opened her mouth to correct him, but before she could, the Duke interjected in a quiet voice, his back to them and his face towards the fire. "Divine love, Master Lockridge. It is a sort of romance, but Julian was speaking about God, not a man." Edmund wrinkled his brow. "A Catholic?" "She had good thoughts," the Duke went on, "and we have Cressy to thank for bringing her back to our attention. Her writings were largely lost." "Find something else," Edmund said. "I've no stomach for theology this late in the day." Sarah knew he rarely had stomach for theology at all, but she knew Lucille wouldn't say such a thing, and she kept her eyes down, opening the book and running her finger along the pages, reading aloud. "All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well." She looked up from where her finger lay and closed the book softly. Awfully optimistic lady. The Duke turned quickly, and the fire backlighting him made his brows and eyes seem even blacker than before. "That shows how little you have read the lady in question." She was not blindly optimistic, but acknowledged that there would be many inescapable hardships. She was very aware of the darkness of the world. Sarah knew she should keep her mouth shut and nod in response, but she couldn't help herself. Sliding the book back into place, she said softly, "If I remember correctly, that is only a part of what she wrote. The primary point was love. Remember, she wrote, love was his meaning. Who showed it to you? Love. What did he show you? Love. Why did he show it? For love. Then, later, you will not know or learn anything else, ever." She didn't look up to meet the Duke's gaze, but she could sense him across from her, his every movement frozen, as though stalking a deer in the woods. "You've read that?" Edmund asked bluntly, his question shattering the tension. Sarah refused to make eye contact, knowing that her brother was more likely to know her true nature than the Duke. She shrugged and moved on, pulling out another book further on. Before she could investigate, however, Lord Whitehall spoke at last. "We are done with the library," he said curtly. "Follow me." Sarah blinked and replaced the book. She couldn't understand his behaviour. The first genuine moment of interest she'd shown surrounded these books, the first possibility that they might have something in common, and he was ripping them away from that connection. She followed with a bead of frustration forming in her chest. He was insufferable. Edmund pushed ahead when they entered the billiard room. "I haven't played this in a few weeks," he said, adding as an explanation, "We don't have one at my father's house." The natural thing to do would be to offer a game then and there, but the Duke chose instead to stare at Sarah's brother with a disdainful smile curling his lips. He said nothing, and after a moment's pause, turned to continue the tour elsewhere. The house began to pass by in a sort of blur. There was another gallery and 2 more broad halls. The dining room was fine enough, and Sarah could see the footmen had already laid preparations for their evening meal. The thought of sitting across the table from her rude host rubbed her the wrong way, but she maintained her temper and followed through the dining room and into the gorgeous holding parlour beyond. They were back at the pianoforte, and here the Duke turned in a shallow voice and offered again for her to take her seat at the instrument and play. Sarah closed her lips tightly. Lucille was the musician, not her. "I don't feel like playing at the moment," she answered lamely. The Duke would have let it be, but Edmund spoke up. "You always feel like playing, Lucille. Besides," he said, taking her elbow, "you know father would want you to." She wished more than anything that her little brother had stayed at home, that she'd been given her mother as a chaperone, or anyone but this small, snivelling boy who would surely tell her father everything that had transpired, including any decision to deny her betrothed. She forced a smile. "I suppose something short wouldn't hurt." She sat down at the pianoforte and pulled out the first thing that came to mind, a grotesquely simple Scottish tune about a lass stranded in the woods in her search for her beloved. It had a pretty enough melody, and doubtless would have been sweet if she'd sung it only, but her time had been taken up with books as of late, and it had been years since she'd touched the pianoforte. The notes were all wrong, and even when the melody was well established, it ricocheted at odd intervals when she would slip and hit the wrong note. When the song was finally done, Sarah looked up to see Edmund eyeing her with a strange expression. She lowered her eyes and blushed, partly to mask her nature and partly out of genuine embarrassment. "I'm nervous," she said in weak explanation. Edmund looked flabbergasted, but the Duke's bored expression was even more of an insult. He looked weary of her already. "Would you like to see the gardens?" he asked without comment on her performance. "Yes, please," she answered dully, feeling suddenly weary herself. They walked outside through the balcony onto the back grounds. The gardens were impressive, even more so than the house, and Sarah realised that under any other circumstances she could have found a measure of peace in the well-curated vines and hedges. As it was, she couldn't stop to rest, with the long stride of the Duke leading the way and her embarrassment following close behind. At the end of the garden there was a tall willow tree with thick branches and a wide wooden swing beneath it. Sarah walked to it and sat down, swinging her legs gently beneath it. "This is lovely," she said quietly. More to herself than to her host, he said nothing, and after a long interval, she looked up and found him staring at her with an almost violent expression. "What is it?" she asked. "That swing hasn't been used in many years," he said hoarsely. "Well, you're keeping the best things hidden away," she said with a weak smile, trying to soften his dour expression. It baffled her that he would demand a marriage with one of Edgar Lockridge's daughters, and then behave so abominably when his wish was granted. You must be forthright about all that you bring to the table. She meant it as a teasing thing, a sweet softening that cost her a bit of dignity, but would give him an excuse to break that black expression he wore so unflinchingly. Instead, the storm clouds gathered even more, and he took a menacing step forward. You speak of me lying about what I bring to the table. That is amusingly ironic, my lady. I heard that you were of a peaceful nature and had a talent for music. You come into my house and bring only unrest and out-of-tune children's lullabies. Sarah stared at him for a second in shock. She had been spoken to by her father in that way, but never by a gentleman, especially one who was seeking her hand. She realised with a start that she would not stand for it. She wouldn't become a shut-away, miserable shell of a woman like her mother. She would stay the course for Lucille's sake, but while keeping her wits and courage about her. She leapt up from the swing and stepped forward herself, coming only an arm's length away from the Duke. "Pardon me for intruding on your life with my bumbling ways," she snapped. "I will save you any further pain. Edmund, come with me." She started to walk past the Duke, but he stepped in front of her. "You can't leave," he said, the anger still twisting over his face. "We are to dine together this evening." She stopped, her head down, her shoulder in line with his. "If you think," she said softly, so as to keep Edmund from hearing, "that I am going to sit quietly across the table from you and put up with your abuse for an entire evening, you are grossly mistaken. Father told me that you were in love with me and that you desired this marriage. If that is true, you are doing a poor job of showing it. The only way—" She paused and lowered her voice another notch. "The only way I would even consider returning to this miserable place is if you amend your behaviour and address me as a woman worthy of conversation. So far, you have been a boorish brute, speaking to me in a way you wouldn't even address the worst of your geldings." She shook her head ever so slightly. "I'll not have it." She walked past him with her breath shaking in her chest and her hands by her sides, weak with adrenaline. She could hear Edmund scrambling to follow close behind. "Where are we going?" he asked breathlessly. Sarah put on Lucille's quiet voice again and said, "I'm afraid the Duke would like us to leave." Edmund didn't argue, perhaps because he sensed the urgency of her movements, perhaps because he was still too young to exert the force of Edgar's nature. Either way, Sarah pressed on with purpose and escaped the house without further hindrance. Once, before she left the gardens, she turned to see if the Duke had followed her. He was standing with his back to her, still under the willow tree where she'd left him, his gaze turned toward the empty swing swaying in the wake of her leaving. Chapter 6. He didn't know how long he stood in that garden, staring at the place where Lucille had left and fighting against the memories of Letty that rose thick and fast into his head. But when he turned around, the girl and her brother were gone. He walked slowly back through the garden, turning off the paved path to the wild roses that grew as a border to the grounds. They were still budding, but he knew they would be in full bloom soon. He never picked them, not anymore, and when they blossomed open, he wouldn't even walk to that corner of the garden, for now it was still safe from Letty's ghost, and he made his way down the row at a leisurely pace. He couldn't stop thinking about Lucille Lockridge and the side of herself she had shown upon her visit. When she'd chosen Julian's writings from his library, seemingly at random, and then known such an obscure passage by heart, he had been startled, but that was nothing compared to what he'd observed in the garden before she'd walked away. There was a fire in her that had burned him. He could still feel the singed edges of his pride as he remembered it, and a keen intelligence in her eyes. She'd managed to keep it under wraps for most of their interaction, but it had risen to the surface there in the library, and again in her fury. He couldn't be certain, but if he had been a betting man, he would have said she had as violent a temper as he did himself. She'd stood up for herself, demanding him to treat her with respect, and he would not have imagined it possible before today. He had asked about her in the few days since Edgar's blackmail had arrived at his door, and the answer had always been the same. Lucille Lockridge was a woman without wit or spirit. One of his acquaintances at the club in London, a young man by the name of William Shepherd, whose father served in the House of Lords alongside Augustus, had claimed to know Lucille personally from when they were children. "You don't want to marry Lucille Lockridge," Shepherd had said with a raised eyebrow. "She's a soft little thing and completely tied to her father's will. If you bring her into your house, she'll be a pawn in Lord Huxley's hand, and he'll use her to bring you around to his way of thinking on every political matter." It had been what Augustus already feared, but to have another confirm his intuition was worrisome at best. "Perhaps she will swear allegiance to her husband when we are wed," he'd ventured. "That girl," Shepherd had countered with a toss of his head. "Once, when we were young, I fancied her. I asked her father for a chance to take her out in my phaeton, and he agreed. When we were out on the trail, she started asking me these quiet, nervous questions about my father's business ventures. It wasn't long before I could see Lord Huxley's strings directing her every movement. I dropped that before it got dangerous, and I suggest you do the same." But Augustus couldn't just drop it. He was tied to Lucille Lockridge by the contents of the letter her father had sent to extort his agreement, and he had no escape. Still, he was beginning to suspect that Shepherd hadn't seen all of Lucille Lockridge, for the woman he'd met today was not the sort of simpering maiden to obey every command her father delivered. He had seen some of that nature earlier in the afternoon, but it had melted away as the day progressed, and he was more and more certain that the first impression had been a facade. Her voice echoed in his memory. "Father said you were in love with me." Initially, he had suspected that Lucille knew about her father's plot and the blackmail and was going along with his plan out of a desire for Augustus's name and station. But now he wasn't so sure. If Edgar Lockridge was selling the fiction that Augustus loved Lucille, then maybe she was in the dark about this entire thing. For the first time, he felt a twinge of genuine regret. She wasn't the love of his life. She wasn't Letty. But still, she was a young girl who had gone to meet with a man she thought loved her, to find only cruelty and disdain waiting for her. She wasn't witless, as people said, or overly emotional either, but she seemed to know her worth and was willing to stand for it. He liked that. He would never have love for her, surely, but here was a place where he could see a future of respect, and if she had a bright mind, he could reason with her about her father's madness. Lord Huxley had placed her there to be a puppet for Tallenhall's best interests, but under the right circumstances, a pawn could become a queen. Lucille Lockridge might have the backbone to turn the tables on her own father. "Don't get ahead of yourself," he said aloud, turning back towards the house. He had only had a short time with Lucille, and one moment of bravery on her part did not a warrior make. But it gave him hope. He had to start somewhere to draw out that spirited woman again, and she had given him the formula for success. He walked back into the house, passing the servants quickly and making his way to the study. He pulled out a piece of paper from his desk and dipped his quill into the ink, tapping it clear, and then beginning to write. "My dear Miss Lockridge," he began. "My reasons for writing are twofold. Firstly, I would like to thank you for your visit today and request that you visit me again. I am fully aware that you will be unwilling to do so, but listen first to the sentiments of my second reason for writing. I would like to offer my sincere and heartfelt apologies." He paused and smiled to himself. It was not a normal thing for Augustus Sutton to apologise, and the lovely Miss Lucille Lockridge would have no idea how rare it was. Still, he knew it was necessary, not only for strategic reasons, but for moral ones as well. An apology would bring her around to his way of thinking, perhaps soften her view of him, and strengthen his arguments about her father's missteps in the House of Lords. Yes, but it would also quell the growing feeling of unease in Augustus's chest that he had done wrong by the wisp of a woman during their earlier conversation. Were I a better man, I would have followed you out of the garden and apologised before your feet had left my house. But as it is, I am forced to take the lesser route. He wrote on, "Please believe me that I find my behaviour from earlier to be grossly misdirected. I was frustrated at something outside your control, and I took it out on you, the coward's last recourse. I spoke to you in a manner not fitting that of a gentleman, and I made you feel unwelcome, though you were a guest in my house. All these things are reprehensible, but above all else, I regret the insults to your character and personality, both of which I found, in fact, to be refreshing and desirable." He was surprised by how true that last sentence was. He wasn't ready to think about the repercussions of that last statement, of the impact her refreshing nature was having on his wounded heart. Even skirting the edge of the subject left him feeling out of control and uncomfortable. He put pen to paper one last time. "Please consider giving me a second chance. I will eagerly await your reply." He sat looking at the letter for a long moment, feeling like he ought to say more, but being unsure what to add. In the end, he simply dusted the top of the paper with sand, waited for it to dry, and then folded the letter into the customary message and sealed it with dark wax, calling for the butler. "Your Grace," Robbins appeared, "I have a letter for you to send to Miss Lockridge." He held out the message. Robbins paused, his expression opaque, and then said slowly, "The lady that only just now left, Your Grace." "Yes, Robbins." Augustus could see the conflicted expression on the butler's face and knew what he was thinking. The delivery of letters was below a butler's station. He should have called for the footman if it was a matter of routine business. Augustus added in a gentler tone, "It is a matter of great importance. Give it to a reliable delivery boy." Robbins softened. "If you say so, Your Grace." He paused in the doorway and looked back. "She looks to be a fine lady, Your Grace." Augustus said nothing, and the butler took his leave in quiet. Robbins had been fond of Letty, having known her almost her entire life as Augustus had. Letty and the butler had, in fact, had a much closer relationship than Augustus ever had with the old man. She used to skip in with almost girlish glee, tossing him her hat and prattling about their adventures as though the butler was a member of the family. Augustus had never understood it, but he had loved it all the same. When Letty was gone, Robbins had taken it hard. He'd visibly maintained his work and position, but he'd lost all his bloom and cheerfulness. Augustus, buried in his own grief, had not noticed until it was too late. Now, with that gentle acknowledgement about Lucille, Robbins was trying to tell Augustus something. Augustus knew the old man was tentatively setting him free to pursue someone else, but, try as he might, Augustus himself couldn't get free of the memory of his other intended. Still, there was something about this woman, his arch-enemy's daughter, that had shaken him to his core. He stood up and walked to the copy of Divine Revelations, pulling it from the shelf and opening it. It fell open to the first passage Lucille had read, but he flipped easily past it to the other passage that was closest to his heart. What did he show you? Love. That white blonde woman with the arresting wild green eyes had reached by accident into the vast expanse of his library and chosen his favourite passage. quoting it by heart. Chapter 7. 2 days passed uneventfully enough, and Sarah was left largely to her own thoughts in the wake of her meeting with the Duke. Lucille, though grateful enough, had gone into town on 2 appointments and missed her chance to debrief with Sarah. Edmund kept to himself, and as usual, Sarah's parents showed little interest in following up with the matter. The only conversation she had about the meeting was with her father, the night she came back early. "I thought you were going to stay for an evening meal," he'd said when she walked in. Edmund had interjected first, as expected. "There was a change of plans, but they'll see each other again soon," he'd said, showing Sarah that he was as afraid of disappointing Edgar as she was. "What did you think of him, Lucille?" her father pressed, his words absent-minded, his eyes on the paper in front of him. "It doesn't matter what I think of him, father," she'd answered as demurely as possible, trying to keep the disdain and frustration out of her voice. "I'm marrying him, aren't I?" "That's right, dear," he'd answered, turning the page on his paper. And that was that. Sarah was left to her own machinations and her growing anger. In truth, she was seething after her first meeting with the Duke, and she didn't expect that feeling to go away any time soon. Augustus Sutton had made it clear that he didn't care for her company. Why he'd sought her hand in the first place was a mystery, but that was to be unravelled at another time. And the more she thought about his curt words and insolent silences, the more furious she became. The only bright thought that tempered her anger was the realization that, had Lucille gone to meet the Duke as was initially intended, the situation would have been far worse. Lucille finally pulled her aside for a few moments on the afternoon of the second day, her eyes wide and worried. How did it go? They were sitting in a window seat at the end of one of the outer halls. It was their safe space since they were children. They used to draw the curtains and huddle inside with books, reading by the light of the window and keeping away from their father's prowling and unpredictable moods. Sarah smiled gently and touched her sister's hand. "He wasn't very likeable, but I've got the situation covered." She tried to make her voice light. "His house is grand. Nothing to be ashamed of there, and there's a pretty little tree outside in a fine set of gardens." Lucille bit her lip. "Not very likeable?" Sarah waved her hand. "You know men. Are there any that are likeable?" "I can think of one," Lucille said softly. "Ah, yes, your secret admirer. Well, we cannot all be as lucky as you, my dear sister." Sarah looked at her twin with a deep tenderness. "I hope you are able to marry for love. You always had the temperament for such things after all. Me, I knew even when I was a girl that I would not be fainting around on behalf of any man. Marriage, as father says, is a business arrangement. I'm making a smart business decision in the Duke, Lucille, and I don't regret it at all." She said it quickly, with a cheerful smile, and she almost believed it. "If you say so," Lucille said doubtfully. "But tell me about him. What was so awful?" "You met him, didn't you?" Sarah said, making an effort to bring only the humorous details to the surface and leaving out all the niggling doubts that truly shook her heart. "He's as big as a Scottish bear and has those dreadful dark eyes. Do you think he's entertaining intelligent thoughts in that brain of his? I'm not certain, but I can tell you he's moody and short-tempered. I felt like a little mouse annoying an elephant." "Mice frighten elephants," Lucille said quietly. "Maybe you frightened him." That brought a genuine smile to Sarah's face. "Nothing could frighten him," she said. "He's got an iron will, and I doubt he'd be easily crossed." "Doesn't that worry you, if you get married?" "No," Sarah lied. "Lucille, you of all people, know that my will is as unbendable as his could ever be. Furthermore, You have seen a good example of marriage in this house. I shall avoid him as much as possible after we've made everything official, and I will live my life as I did before. You should have seen him today. He'll be as happy with that situation as I am, I assure you." "But I thought he loved me," Lucille faltered. "That's what father said." "Maybe he does, in his own way," Sarah shrugged, "but only in his own way. He didn't show any true affection when I was there. He seemed reluctant at best, hostile at worst." In truth, she was counting on his apathy to make marriage bearable. The thought of being tied to him, losing her independence, and stumbling around at his beck and call was intolerable. She would spend her time in the library, and he would be out at the House of Lords, and she would find a way to be content. If they had a child, the thought of all that involved made her shiver with discomfort. Then she would be able to see even less of him. It was common for women to throw their lives into their children, just as her mother had, and then to disappear almost entirely from their husband's frame of reference. It was 3 whole days later when Lucille knocked on her door after everyone had already retired to bed. Sarah scrambled out from between her covers and tiptoed barefoot to the door, letting her sister in and lighting a candle. "Is everything all right?" she asked. "I'm so sorry," Lucille blushed. I found something tonight that I had overlooked earlier." She held up a letter sealed with dark wax. It was unopened, but the Duke's name was written on the front. She held it out. "It was delivered to me the day you went to the Duke's house, but my maid put it on my desk as usual, and I forgot to check until today. I would have given it to you this morning, but there wasn't a chance in front of father." Sarah looked at the paper with disdain. "Why would he be writing to me?" she asked. "Was it before or after my visit?" "I don't know," Lucille answered. "I didn't open it." Sarah took it in her hands, half wanting to toss it directly into the flames, but she was curious. She opened it and read through the lines once, then again, more slowly. When she finished, she handed it to Lucille, for her to read it as well. "What do you think?" her sister asked when she finished. "He sounds so remorseful." "Does he?" Sarah smiled gently, picked up the letter, and carried it to her desk. "Dear innocent Lucille, I think I have read enough books to know fiction when I see it. This preposterous letter does not reflect the attitude or behaviour of the man I met last week. No, Lord Whitehall does not mean what he says in this letter. He may not have even written it himself. He's playing some sort of game, and I am not interested." "You don't know that," Lucille gasped. "Doesn't it make more sense to believe that he is genuine? After all, perhaps you made a good impression on him, and he really is ashamed of his behaviour. Perhaps he has a good reason for being the way he was." "A good reason? For treating me like I was a gold-seeking wench from the lower town? For making me feel as though I was worthless? For pressing the issue so that I had to leave his house on account of his rudeness? You can't be serious, sister." Sarah took out a piece of paper, tossed her braid over one shoulder, and dipped a quill in ink. "What are you going to say?" Lucille asked, coming to sit nearby. "Dear Lord Whitehall," Sarah said, narrating for Lucille's benefit as she wrote. "What a pretty piece of writing that was. It might even have convinced me if I hadn't seen the depth of your disdain for me 5 days past. No, a simple letter will not be sufficient to right this wrong. I am sorry to have to respond to your politic words with bluntness unbefitting of a lady, but I believe a direct manner is called for. I will marry you, but only because my father wishes it. If you are as abrasive and unpleasant in our union as you were over tea, then you can expect a miserable marriage, for in me you have met your match. You have begun our relationship on a battlefield, and though I would have preferred a rose bower, I will fight with what I am given." She signed her sister's name and dumped sand over the signature. Lucille sucked in her breath sharply. You can't be serious, Sarah. You can't send a letter like that to a gentleman. What will he think? Hopefully, he will think that he messed with the wrong Earl's daughter, she said stiffly. Best case, he is astonished and drops his suit. Worst, he is angry, but knows he cannot intimidate me. It's not polite, Sarah. He wasn't polite. But it's not done. I'm sending it. Sarah stood and tucked the letter safely into her dressing gown. I'm taking your place, Lucille, and you must allow me to do this my way. I cannot be run into the ground, especially not by a man who is so infuriating. Lucille swallowed hard. If you think it's best. Sarah looked at her sister with marked tenderness. And that is why you must let me continue the charade, she said. Because you give in so quickly, and this Duke would read your submission as a weakness to be exploited. Aren't you afraid that he will read your rudeness as a call to arms? Sarah moved back toward her bed and crawled under the covers, patting the bedspread beside her. Since the two twins had been children, they'd done this ritual, slipping from separate beds to sleep together. It was as though they were missing a part of themselves when they were far apart, and until that bit was reunited, they couldn't rest fully. As they grew older, Lucille only crept into Sarah's bed when she was lonely or had a bad dream. But tonight, the two sisters lay with their heads together and their eyes on the canopy above. Sarah blew out the candle and cuddled closer. In all honesty, I want my rudeness to be an arresting thing, she admitted. I don't want to end up shut away like Mamma, Lucille. You have to fight against that too. I know you won't end up with the Duke, but you don't know if things will work out with this secret gentleman, and you don't know how he'll change over time. You have to work hard not to roll over so quickly under Father's wishes. Lucille sighed and clasped Sarah's hand in her own, speaking wistfully into the darkness. I wish I was as brave as you, other half. And I wish I were as gentle as you, Sarah said, finishing the mantra they'd repeated to each other since they were children. When 2 days had passed, Sarah began to suspect that the entire ordeal was over. The Duke must have taken her message as a definitive reason not to pursue her and moved on to easier prey. She wondered why she hadn't thought of that as a solution in the first place. Be undesirable enough, and the gentleman in question would run for the hills. She couldn't have been more wrong, for at the end of the second day, a letter came for Miss Lucille Lockridge from Lord Whitehall. Lucille took it to their secret place, curled her legs up gleefully, and held it out. A message came! There was a bright spot of colour in her usually languid cheeks, and she looked almost excited. Please, Sarah, you must read it. I'm dying to know what he said in response. Sarah blinked and took the letter into her hand. He responded. He did. What did I say, Sarah? I told you that he meant it genuinely. I'm sure he's answered back with a more believable explanation, and if so, you must entertain the idea that he's not so awful after all. Sarah knew that her sister was set on discovering Augustus Sutton's good side because Lucille didn't like the idea of her twin marrying a monster, but she wasn't so easily convinced. The letter was not very big, and besides that, she couldn't imagine it holding anything that would convince her to see the Duke again and give him a second chance. After this, she said, holding up her copy of The Lady of the Lake. No. Lucille answered with uncharacteristic firmness. Now. She put the letter in her sister's hands, and Sarah opened it slowly, her curiosity getting the better of her as she finally spread it out in her lap. She read it in moments, and then gave a short little laugh. Lucille looked up at her in alarm. What is amusing? It's just that, a moment ago, I thought to myself that there was nothing he could write that would convince me to see him, Sarah said with a smile. And he managed to write the one thing that would, Sarah said, holding up the letter for her sister to view. Written there in a single line, without introduction or signature, were 2 sentences. Very well, my lady. Let us draw up battle lines tomorrow at the Camden Society Ball.
Scan the QR code or click on the link in the description to read the full book. The full audiobook will be available on YouTube in a few days. What did you like the most? Comment below and share this video on your social media and with your friends. Watch one of the following videos. Subscribe to our channel, like this video, and hit the notification bell to not miss any new audiobooks. Thank you for watching.